In 1862, our government passed the Homestead Act. This was a law that said that any family that settled in certain areas of the West would receive 160 acres of land. To keep this land for his own, the head of the family had to live on that land and farm it for 5 years. This sounds like a good offer, but there were several problems with it. At the time the law was passed, the Civil War was going on. Families were concerned with the problems of the war. There were also still problems with the Indians in the West. Many men did not want to risk the lives of their families for a free farm. There was also another problem. Many people wondered how they could farm in the West because of the hot, dry summers of the Great Plains. What crops could survive in this weather? But when the Civil War was over, many people were willing to try. By this time, the Indians were being placed on reservations. New methods of farming with less water made it possible to grow some crops, and many soldiers returned home from the war restless and eager for a change. As the years passed, there was less and less land for the government to give away in the West, for more and more people were settling there as a result of the Homestead Act. As the government made land available for settlement, there would be great land rush. People would line up in wagons and on horses, waiting to claim their 160 acres that the government would give them. Originally, the government had given the territory known as the Oklahoma land to the Indians. But once again, the Indians were moved to it, and a date was set aside for the settlers to claim land in Oklahoma. The year was 1889. The day came for the great Oklahoma land rush. Many thousands of people were lined up along the borders of Oklahoma. Some were in carriages, some in wagons, and some in trains. Some were on horseback, and some were on foot. Soldiers guarded the borders. No one could move over the border until a signal was given. At last, at noon, the signal was given. The eager settlers began the scramble to find some land that they could call their own. You can see why this was called a land rush. Before the day was over, most of the land in the Oklahoma Territory was claimed. In 1890, it was announced that there was no more frontier land left in the United States. There were still large unsettled areas, and there were still some homesteads to be given away, but there was no longer a clear line drawn between an unsettled area and a settled area. People worth knowing more about. Cyrus McCormick. Thousands of people moved to the West to homestead. Most farmers planted wheat. The plains filled up with wheat so fast that it was hard to find workers to harvest it all. Once again, an ingenious American came up with a solution to a knotty problem. Cyrus McCormick was a Virginian who liked to tinker around with mechanical devices. One of his projects was a mechanical reaper that his father had tried unsuccessfully to build. Cyrus studied his father's designs and made improvements on them. In 1831, Cyrus invited his neighbors to watch his first demonstration of his mechanical reaper. He hitched horses to the reaper, climbed aboard, and headed into a wheat field. The reaper cut down the wheat neatly and evenly. It would have taken several men hours and hours to get down that wheat field, but Cyrus McCormick did it by himself in a brief time. McCormick set up a factory for producing reapers in Chicago near the plains. Farmers everywhere ordered McCormick reapers. Cyrus McCormick became a wealthy man, and his ingenuity helped make farming easier and more efficient. Okay, so here's some review of what we've learned this week in history. First, we learned about George Washington Carver. He was a famous scientist who found many uses for peanuts and discovered all the different plants that could be grown in the South to recover the soil. Then we learned about Booker T. Washington. He was the man who founded and built the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama that educated many young black people of the time. We've learned that Utah is the state where the Transcontinental Railroad was finished. And we learned about the buffalo and how important they were to the Indians. They gave them food, shelter, and clothing. We learned that the Indians unfortunately were placed into reservations, which were pieces of land that the U.S. set aside for them. We learned that a stampede is a sudden rush or running around by a frightened group of cattle. We learned that the Union Pacific Company was one of the two companies that built the Transcontinental Railroad. We now know that the West was the only frontier that remained to be settled by the middle 1800s, or the post-Civil War era. And we know that the Transcontinental Railroad was what brought the East closer to the West. And we also now know that cowboys, their job was to herd the cattle. They were hired by ranchers to take care of their cattle. So these are the things that you need to know for the quiz that we will have on Monday.